just felt this draft was a little bit interesting to me, Rohan. I mean, the consensus with 49er faithful was that coming out of this draft, the 49ers were going to get some kind of center help, a safety, a slot corner, maybe an edge, maybe a receiver thrown in there, probably a late round running back. But if anybody, like the chances of anybody picking the type this draft, the way the 49ers draft, was very different. Clearly, a lot of the things that the faithful thought that a front office was going to do, they didn't do. So I wanted to get a sense from you about taking the big picture of what the 49ers did this weekend in the draft. What did we learn about the vision of this front office?
Yeah, so I mean, let's talk about it, right? Last week, what did John Lynch say during his pre-draft press conference on Monday? John Lynch, he comes out and says, we embrace competition at every position. And I mean, many alluded to that being at the quarterback position, right? Where Jimmy Garoppolo and Trey Lance are currently the two best quarterbacks on the roster. But in reality, it was for every position in the draft. The 49ers didn't go in with a significant, it's not that they didn't go in maybe with a significant need, but they went in with the purpose of selecting players to build to their roster rather than addressing a specific position immediately. And so you look at the draft and you look at the conclusion, you have a ton of edge and defensive lineman overall talent, right? Because you would added Kimoko Toure the week before the draft. Then you draft two players, not just one, but two, in Drake Jackson and Kalia Davis, to now have an extremely deep defensive line room that can battle it out in training camp and in the offseason program. Then look at the wide receiver room, right? You had 5-6 active bodies before the draft. You bring in Danny Gray, and now you have another good spot of competition there. And not only that, you go out an undrafted free agency and you sign guys like Taysir Mack, and then you also sign Tay Martin out of Oklahoma State. The former was out of Pittsburgh, and Martin is out of Oklahoma State. Some other extra bodies, so you have another 8-9 guys that can compete there. Cornerback, you don't just draft one, you draft Womack, but also draft Tariq Castro-Fields on top of signing back Jason Verrett to have an extremely deep cornerback room as well as signing a good amount of undrafted free agents. The 49ers were really busy in the undrafted free agent pool. And then offensive line. 2 offensive linemen there in the draft, 2 top-tier offensive linemen in undrafted free agency in Donovan West and Jason Poe, as well as a couple of extra additions like Sam Schluter out of Minnesota. So really, to me, it was expanding on what they said about the depth, and they really looked to solidify it, not really just one position, but every position on their roster.
Yeah, I mean, I think you said it very well, Rohan. I mean, clearly this team or this front office was happy with the roster that they have. I think they felt like they had starters at every single position. And I think, maybe some of the faithful looked at positions like center, positions like safety, positions like slot corner, and felt like there was a big need for those positions because maybe the fan base isn't as secure in having solutions on the roster as is. But I think overall what I'm really learning, Rohan, and you talked about the depth, but it looks like the 49ers do value depth over just premium talent. It seems like this team believes in their ability to draft, believe in their ability to develop, and it seems like they're looking for more guys that aren't necessarily needing to come in year one and be impactful players, but guys that are going to be rotation players, starters in the next 2 to 3 years. And I think that's kind of what we've seen these last few drafts. And it seems like this team is when I look at it, Rohan, it reminds me a lot of what Bill Belichick does with the New England Patriots back when they had the dynasty. Obviously, they had the quarterback position solidified with the GOAT and Tom Brady. But when it came to the draft, it was all about just sheer numbers. You just bring in sheer number of players. Some of them work out, some of them don't work out. But that ended up creating a dynasty where you're able to move off of guys a year early versus a year late because you constantly have a replacement, a young up-and-coming replacement that's been sitting on the bench maybe for a year, 2 years, that could come in, knows the system, and be productive immediately when they get the chance.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
Right?
No, I was just going to ask you, if that is the vision, how do you feel about that vision being, because it's somewhat different from what previous 49er regimes kind of their, I guess, their way of approaching this.
Yeah, and I mean, I think first of all, the interesting point that you bring up about depth over premium talent, I think we had a clear example of that from the early part of the Shanahan-Lynch regime to the current day. In 2019, what did Kyle Shanahan, or prior to the season, Kyle Shanahan and John Lynch said, guess what? We want to solidify the defensive line, make it the most important position of our entire team, and make it the most feared. They go ahead, they trade a second-round pick for Dee Ford, pay him 5 years, $87.5 million. Now, in my opinion, at the time, that despite the injury concerns, obviously, that was an addition of premium talent as opposed to depth, right? No, so while it wasn't as deep as other lines have been, you had Dee Ford, you had DeForest Buckner, Arik Armstead, and Nick Bosa, one of the best defensive lines in terms of pure talent. However, in 2021, the 49ers had very, very similar success despite going with a completely different approach. You don't have 4 superstars, right? Instead, DeForest Buckner is no longer with the team. Dee Ford had a much lower role. And instead, it's not one player, but a multitude of players that step in and contribute in limited roles, like an Arden Key, like a Jordan Willis, like a Charles Omenihu added in the middle of the season, like a Kevin Givens, Kentavious Street at the defensive tackle position, like a DJ Jones. You know, you have all these a multitude of role players that kind of fill in, but it's surprisingly enough, because of how elite the coaching staff has been on the defensive line, the production remains the same. And so, yeah, I do think that this is important because the 49ers have shown that they can win with depth over premium talent. And I think that could be a new thing because especially in the era that we are in today, where a lot of players are getting paid top tier money, to maintain rosters that can compete on a consistent basis, you can't necessarily acquire a ton of premium talent and have that on your roster because it's just not the best way to build a roster because you have so many holes. Instead, if you get depth pieces at certain positions while also having premium talent like a Deebo Samuel, Nick Bosa, and the 6 premier players that the 49ers have, you can build a roster around that, and you can have a roster that is filled with talent at multiple positions of need.
Yeah, and I think, I started it by saying premium talent, but it's not that the 49ers are void of premium talent. It's just most of their premium talent is homegrown, right?
Exactly.
They've been able to draft very, very well, to draft multiple, all pros that are their premium talent. I mean, they don't have to go out in free agency and fill a whole bunch of holes with premium talent, kind of like what, we see the shift or the stark dichotomy with the Rams in the same division. They're more, forget about the homegrown. Let's go out, trade potential players for players that we know are performing. It obviously led them to a Super Bowl last season, but it seems like the 49ers, instead of going more towards that thought process, they just double down on their own thought process, which I want to ask you again, how do you feel about this? Because this is clearly a philosophy that this team is starting to implement. Do you believe in it, or do you think that the other side of maybe what the Rams are doing, what Tampa Bay did to win their Super Bowl, do you think that's the way to, be able to be competitive?
No, I think there isn't necessarily a wrong way, right? Because obviously both those teams have shown that they can win Super Bowls with that type of roster building, right? Tampa Bay obviously acquired Tom Brady via free agency, and some of their talent was homegrown. I do think, though, the one thing that has been understated with both of those teams and the 49ers is that they are very good at drafting. The Rams find good players in the mid rounds, in the late rounds, that fill out their roster as those depth pieces we were talking about, which is why. But because they acquire so much talent outside of those draft picks get overlooked in a way. Like Ernest Jones was a rookie last year. Nobody knows who he is, but he played fairly solid as the main linebacker for the Los Angeles Rams last year. Now, when you talk about the linebacker position for the Rams, it's their weak spot. Everyone says, oh, throw against the middle against the Rams. And that's because you have guys like Troy Reader and things, and you have such talent on the defensive line and in the secondary that you overlook players like Ernest Jones. But the point is that I'm making is both teams draft pretty well, but they also acquire a ton of talent. And I'm not thinking that the 49ers really stray away from that, right? You see Trent Williams on the roster. You've seen guys like Quan Alexander, Dee Ford. I can name players and players, Weston Richburg, Richard Sherman. It's just not necessarily worked out to the magnitude that it's worked out for the other two teams for the 49ers. So their picks that they've made have been spotlighted a lot more. Also, they were also worse teams when they started, and they didn't necessarily trade multiple first-round picks for a guy like Jared Goff to draft him. Instead, they stayed put, and they had multiple first-round selections over the years, which is where they've been allowed to acquire top-tier talent, as well as the late-round bloomers like a George Kittle and Fred Warner, and multiple players like that in the past. So I don't think that it's necessarily completely different strategies that these teams are incorporating. It's just for some teams, one of those strategies works, like building through free agency and trades. And for another team, like the drafting is a little better than those moves for the 49ers specifically.
Yeah, and I think you made a extremely smart point. The 49ers have tried to be aggressive as far as bringing in, players, and not all of them have worked out. Dee Ford was somebody that they brought in. Unfortunately, his injuries held him back from really making as big of an impact when he did play. Obviously, he made the impact, so on and so forth. Really like few and far between it has worked. I mean, a guy like Trent Williams, obviously, Lakin worked, Alex Mack seems to be working, but for the most part, it seems like some of those big swings that they have made haven't panned out. So it makes sense why they would just double down, because they seem to draft very, very well. So might as well continue to do that. James Coombs asked a really good question, Rohan, and I want to get your idea on it. Questions about draft philosophy. Who do you think is the main architect of the draft? Is it Lynch, Adam Peters, or Kyle Shanahan?
I think it's a combination of all of them.
Cop out.
No,
I'm just kidding.
Because everyone always points to Lynch, Peters, and Kyle Shanahan when you make these draft assumptions, right? But in reality, it's not necessarily just them. It's the area scouts for every single place, right? Like guys like Nick Zakelj that people have never heard of before. I mean, I personally heard of him because of the combine, but guys like him, people have never heard of before. How do these guys get on radars? And that's because of the area scouts that find out, oh, this is one of the best players in our area. That gets translated up and up the ladder. And then obviously people are advocating for drafting those players. I personally think out of these three, it would be Lynch a little more, or sorry, not Lynch, Peters a little more in terms of the players, because he's the one who's mainly like looking over who's the best players on the board and who like the 49ers have gone through and who they like the most, because he's the one most involved with that. But in terms of philosophy, I think it's Shanahan, because obviously the offense revolves around Kyle Shanahan's mind. Tyrion Davis-Price is a Kyle Shanahan pick. I think like that's the reason the 49ers selected him. Same with Danny Gray, who excels after the catch and also has that deep speed that Kyle Shanahan really wants that he lacks now that he had in Atlanta with a guy like Julio Jones as a deep threat, right? So I think philosophy-wise, it might be Shanahan. Players-wise, it might be Peters, and then personnel-wise, it might be Lynch.